Erik, Chapter 6. Miriam had never made any secret of the fact that she was kept in the palace to serve the Shah. 2 years before, I might have imagined her duties to be standing at his elbow with a platter of figs, or something as mundane. But I knew better now, after seeing the Shah come into the harem nearly nightly to spend his evenings with one or another, or several, of his women. I managed to push the knowledge to the back of my mind as the Shah visited the same women night after night, leaving Miriam and the rest alone. Miriam's kindness toward me made me fiercely protective of her, and I would often try to show my protection by cleaning her cell extra well, or bringing her an extra beverage, anything to make her feel cherished and cared for. I sometimes thought she felt as ashamed of her mixed heritage as I did of my face. I tried to prove to her through my actions that she needn't be ashamed of who she was. I finally faced up to it and admitted to myself that I adored her. One night, the Shah came to the harem in a black mood. He passed right by the women who normally enjoyed his attentions and strode up to Miriam where she sat conversing with me over a game of chess. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. I watched as she blinked a couple times and changed her entire demeanor. My studious, bookish friend disappeared and was instantly replaced by a seductive siren of a woman. She curved her body toward him and took his hand, pulling him toward her own little cell, looking back over her shoulder at him from under lowered eyelashes. She had certainly learned the lessons that the other women had taught her very well. I was sure that she must be quaking inside, but she gave no sign of it as she disappeared into her cell with him. I shakily got to my feet, as my duty required. It was my job to stand guard outside the cell while the Shah was with his woman. The problem was that I now thought of her as my woman. My mind was racing as I tried to think up an acceptable excuse to interrupt their activities. My normally clever brain came up with nothing, though, and I heard a muffled whimper from inside the room that told me that the deed had been done. I stood, head whirling with rage and pain, until the Shah strode forth from the room, good mood restored. The black cloud that had followed him in tonight now rested on my own brow. I waited as long as I could stand it, then knocked quietly on the doorframe. When there was no response, I tentatively poked my head inside. My studious friend had returned. She sat, dressed again, on the edge of her bed, head hanging down and arms wrapped around herself. I crossed the little room in 2 steps and knelt before her. I began to babble. "I'm sorry, Miriam. I tried to think of a reason to interrupt you, to get him out of here, but I couldn't think of anything. I feel so stupid. I know I've no justification to stop you doing your duty, to deny him his rights, except that I have come to care for you deeply. Don't worry, I know you can't love me back, not with this face." I trailed off as she gently put her finger over my lips. I took a deep, shaky breath and searched her face. She shook herself out of the serenely depressed state I'd found her in and focused her gaze on me. Even though it was she who had been used, she still made the effort to reassure and calm me.
"I'm fine, my friend. Just fine. He didn't hurt me, and now he will probably leave me alone for a long time."
She looked at me for a long moment, then gently took the mask from my face.
"And as for yourself, do you imagine that I have not noticed the way you take such good care of me? Your face does not truly reflect the person you are within. You are good and kind and entirely too rash. I am not free to love you, and you are not free to love anyone at all. We certainly may not love each other, not and keep our heads. There's a reason none of these cells have doors. I wish with all my heart that it was otherwise, but it cannot be."
A tear slid silently down her face. I cast a quick glance at the doorway before I reached out to wipe it away with my thumb. She caught my hand and kissed it once before giving it back to me. She lifted her eyes to mine, and I felt my heart turn over in my chest as I read their silent message. "My room," I breathed. "My room. It has a door." Come to me. Tonight. I lifted her hand, kissed it once, and returned it to her. I love you. Then I slipped out the door, returning the mask to my face as I went. On the other side of the doorway, I almost ran into Khadija. My first impression was that she had just arrived at the little room to check on Miriam. I knew that there was a formal checklist she ran through with the girls after they had been officially deflowered, although I had no idea what was on it. I bowed my head to her and moved off across the main room. But a worrisome thought struck me, and I whirled to check what I thought I had seen. I could not be sure, but it was quite possible that Khadija's position relative to the doorway meant she had been listening to us for a few moments. I reassured myself by remembering that Khadija did not speak French. That night, after I finished tidying the empty rooms, I retreated to my chamber. They no longer bothered to lock me in at night. To most of the women, I was like furniture, an amenity that they could call on at will and ignore the rest of the time. I spent the night in an agony of anticipation. Would Miriam really come to me? I tidied my little room obsessively, even though I never spent enough time in it to make it untidy. Not for me the long afternoons of lounging on my bed with a novel. I was always either in my bed asleep or out of the room entirely, serving the whims of others. I kept my little candle lit, waiting for the tap on the door. I also kept my mask on, even though I now knew she was comfortable seeing me without it. There was a tap on the door, so faint that I thought I imagined it. I ripped the door open anyway and saw Miriam standing there. Overcome by a fierce possessive joy, I seized her hands and pulled her close to give her a fervent kiss. Her lips were soft when they met mine, and she smelled like figs. Our lips had barely touched when the slides on a dozen lanterns were ripped back, flooding the room with light. Our indiscretion was discovered. I pulled Miriam closer to me as we struggled to make sense of what had just happened. I felt her trembling in my arms as she took it in. The lanterns were held by Khadija and her friends, who had apparently hidden themselves in the shadows of the main room after I retired. The room erupted into yells and screams as the women discovered us kissing, which roused all the women who had not been involved in the ambush. One woman ran to the door and summoned the palace guards who stood outside. Miriam and I were ripped apart and held securely by hardened soldiers. Then we were marched out of the harem rooms. I looked over at Miriam as we were frog-marched down the dimly lit corridors. I began to babble again, saying, "I'm sorry," over and over again as we went. She looked back at me once, but said nothing. Finally, a guard, irritated by my repetitive pleading, put his hand over my mouth. We descended ever downward through the palace until we stood in a dark hallway. A cell door was opened in front of me, and I was shoved inside. Panic took complete hold of me as the door swung shut, and I pressed my face to the narrow barred aperture. I shouted, "Miriam! Miriam! I love you!" And I heard one sob tear from her throat as she was hustled down the hall to another cell. I retreated to the corner and curled up in the little ball that captivity always seems to reduce me to. A shutter slammed over the opening in the door, leaving me in complete darkness. I do not know how I passed the night. I called at the top of my lungs for Miriam, but she never answered me, and eventually I gave it up. I berated myself unceasingly for inviting her to my room. I assigned her none of the blame for having come to me. As I obsessively replayed the events of the evening over and over, it seemed to me that Khadija must have been listening outside Miriam's cell. I didn't think she had magically acquired the ability to understand our French, but I kicked myself when I realized that the kiss I had given Miriam's hand would sound the same in any language. Eventually, the call to prayer announced the daybreak. Soon after prayer was finished, a man presented himself at my cell. I recognized him as the official who had spoken to me in French on the night I had arrived. He introduced himself as Zara, the daroga. "What does that mean, monsieur?" I inquired. I hardly cared, but felt it polite to ask. "It means I am the chief of police for the Shah," he replied. "I also am the liaison for other countries that request Persia's assistance in solving crimes. This poster came to us a couple of years ago from Turkey. Is it yourself, sir? He passed a broadsheet through the door to me. I held in my hand the broadsheet that I had glimpsed in the hands of the police officers in Constantinople before fleeing by boat to Rize. In truth, the sketch looked nothing like me, except for the mask that was an exact match for my own. I dropped my gaze to the text that was written in several languages below the sketch. Wanted. Erik Dessler. Murder, strangulation. Wears a mask to cover disfigurement on right side of face. Good with hands. May apply for job working with machines. Uncommonly clever. Use caution if cornered. I wasn't sure what to say upon reading it. I'd never seen myself described in quite those terms. And the name, Dessler, actually belonged to my foster father. I had never called myself that. The management of the fair must have assumed I went by that name and given it to the officials who came to investigate the manager's murder. I looked closer at the daroga. He seemed like he was holding something back, and suddenly I was on fire to know what it was. Let's say that it is me. What does that mean? I hedged, trying to get him to spill what he wasn't telling. Well, sir, if it was you, I might have a way for you to avoid the executioner's blade. You know, of course, that the crime of which you stand accused here in Persia, the crime to which there are a full dozen of witnesses, carries the death penalty. I know I paled, but I made myself stand taller as he said this. Miriam had warned me, after all. I was ready. He continued, the Shah has been having problems with dissidents in Persia and out of it. He searches for a way to execute those convicted of treason that will strike fear into the hearts of those who are considering taking the same path. He has consulted with several engineers to create specialized chambers in his new palace of Mazandaran. Chambers that may be used to create legends of the penalties involved in such crimes. You want me to create torture chambers? I tried to cut through his circumventions to the truth. The Shah would be willing to consider your drawings if you were to create them. If he likes them, he may keep you alive long enough to oversee their construction. It could extend your life considerably. He has not yet received a design that he feels strikes the proper amount of fear. He passed me a pencil through the bars, leaving me with the blank back of the sheet. He walked away. I scarcely noticed, as I was already lost in thought. A guard entered shortly after to light the lantern that hung from the apex of the vaulted ceiling. It burned steadily through the night. I spread the sheet out on the floor and sketched furiously as ideas, horrible ideas, came to me. I rejected ideas left, right, and center, feeling that they were too tame and would not inspire fear in those who plotted against the Shah. By the time the daroga returned the next day, I had what I hoped was a winning entry. I envisioned a circle of tiny, nearly square rooms. Doors in each would lead the prisoner from one room to another. The nearly square angles of each room would prevent the prisoner from realizing that they were only going in a circle. In each room, there would only be a choice of two doors, one going forward and one going backward. The Shah's portrait would be painted on the walls that did not have doors, an identical one in every room. The portrait would serve to remind the prisoner why they were here in the first place. I envisioned the prisoner circling and circling through the doors, slowly going mad at the repetition of the scenery. In one of the tiny rooms, there would be a secret panel that opened via a hidden trigger switch, disguised to look like an ordinary stretch of wall. If triggered, this secret panel would lead to a staircase. When the prisoner stepped on the first step of the staircase, large stones would slide out of overhead channels and thump to the floor behind him. This was intended to frighten him further up the staircase. The prisoner would be moving so fast up the staircase that they would fail to notice the second secret door on the landing, one that led to safety. The staircase took a left turn, and the entire flight of stairs after the landing was rigged to fold flat under the prisoner's weight and turn into a slide, which deposited them back into one of the circle of rooms. The entire circle could be moved on a rotating platform, so that the prisoner landed in a different little room each time that they failed the staircase test, making it so they couldn't keep a reliable count of how many rooms there were between their landing spot and the door leading to the staircase. And when the Shah tired of watching the sport from above, one of the little rooms could have both its doors locked, and a heavy stone could be dropped into it. This could be an instant crush of rock causing immediate death, or a slow descent of stone that hemmed the prisoner in from above, driving them to the ground and squeezing the breath from their lungs before cracking their ribs and skull. I thought to myself with a touch of arrogance that it couldn't be solved by anyone less clever than I. To my surprise, the Shah agreed. I was taken before him after a few days, chained hand and foot, to officially beg his pardon. It did not matter that he didn't even know Miriam's name. It did not matter that he did not love her. It did not matter that I had only kissed her, and barely done even that. I still had to prostrate myself before him and beg for his pardon. She and I had defied his absolute power over us. And now, we had to wait to see if he would choose to exercise that power. One of the guards who escorted me in there warned me that if I mentioned her at all, if I dared utter anything but the proscribed supplication for pardon, the Shah was liable to have both of our tongues cut out. I obeyed all the instructions I was given and was spared half a royal glance through his narrowed eyes before he waved his hand at the guard to take me away. The next day, I was taken on a tour of the new palace. There was a large circular hall already half built that would be perfect for my design. I gave some tentative instructions as to what I wanted to see done to bring my vision to life. I gained confidence every time I asked for something, and a workman leaped to accomplish my request. By the time I left the site, I felt myself fully in charge of the project and was already planning out the next stages of the construction. If you imagine that I forgot about Miriam in the whirl of my new life as chief engineer, you would be wrong. I hoped she still lived deep within the prison. I had no idea if the Shah would extend the same mercy to her that he had to me. I still thought she had been wronged by the whole ordeal and laid the blame squarely on myself. I hoped my design and my work in building it might be enough to win her release as well as mine. I did not dare dream any further than that. Months passed. I started my 16th summer. The tower containing my torture system in the viewing gallery rose. I tried not to think about what would happen to those who constructed it and knew its secrets. I knew they were all herded back to a secure prison, the same as I was, at night, to prevent word of the secrets from leaking out to the public. I think I convinced myself that they would remain locked up there forever after construction was complete. I do not actually know what befell them in the end, although I have my suspicions. The Shah continued to press me for designs, and I continued to oblige, hoping with each new bloodthirsty system to win Miriam's release. I designed a tiny cage surrounded by rotating faces in effigy, in a room which would echo with laughter. I hoped to recreate the early horror I had felt when caged at the circus for the poor prisoner inside. I created the maze of rotating mirrors that made me famous later in my life. The maze that no one could find their way out of, but which contained a helpful noose hanging from a fake tree. That was there so they could conveniently end their own life, and no one could say that the Shah had killed them. I created a system in which a skin irritant was administered to the free left arm of a restrained prisoner, and the only way that they could relieve the itch was to scratch their skin against a blade suspended nearby, a blade that they had been told may, or may not, be coated in poison, according to the whim of the Shah. I resolutely shut my eyes to the agony these men would endure. I had learned that the Shah's power was not to be belittled. These prisoners would learn it too. The day finally came when the torture system's construction was complete. I'd tested it myself. The upper staircase folded flat at the slightest weight upon it. The stones fell smoothly down onto the lower staircase and retracted neatly into the ceiling via the chains bolted to their topsides. The circle of rooms spun at the flick of a lever in the viewing gallery. The Shah joined me in the gallery as we prepared for the first test on a live prisoner. I watched below as guards carried in a limp body. The prisoner had been drugged so that they could not see how they had arrived in the torture system. I barely spared them a glance, as I was making sure that everything was calibrated exactly as it should be. The prisoner awoke, stood, and set off around the circle, walking away from the gallery. The sound of opening and closing doors rose up to us. As the prisoner rounded the circle of rooms and began to come back toward us, I finally finished my checks and glanced at the prisoner. My attention was riveted when I saw that it was Miriam, walking through each cubicle with a crease in her brow as she began to realize something was not right. The light from the chandelier suspended overhead shone through the open ceilings of each room on her black hair, which she was no longer allowed to cover with a veil. I opened my mouth and took a breath, intending to shout, to warn her, to give her instructions on how to survive. The Shah had been watching me, of course. At a flick of his eyebrow, his two guards leaped forward from behind me. One gagged me so I could not shout, and the other quickly tied my hands behind my back so I could not touch any of the controls before me. Not that any of them would do her any good anyways, I thought. I had designed the system so it not only locked the prisoner in, it locked any would-be rescuers out, preventing kind-hearted executioners from showing mercy to their victims. The only lever I had that would make anything better for her was the one that would lock her in between two doors and drop a ton of rock on her head in one fell swoop. That, at least, would end her torture quickly. But it was as inaccessible to me as if it were on the moon. I could only hope that Miriam would somehow find the door leading off the landing of the staircase, the door I had taken such pains to conceal. The Shah had grudgingly agreed during the design phase that anyone clever enough to find the route to safety under such extreme stress should be freed from the chamber and put to work on the Shah's behalf, as I had been. Would the woman I loved prove herself smarter than I was? In the end, she did not. I watched in hope as Miriam, her loveliness undiminished by prison, found the door leading to the staircase. Then hope turned to agony as she failed 3 times, sliding down the staircase and landing in a heap at the bottom. The 3rd time, a sickening crack echoed up from the room she landed in. She tried to stand and move off through the rooms again, but her legs seemed unable to bear the slightest weight. The Shah rotated the rooms until she was underneath the gallery, underneath the stones set to fall on her, ending her life. He pressed the switch to lock the doors on either side of her. Then he looked at the guards. Release his hands. They jumped to comply, and then stood guard at the door. You have done admirably. I have no doubt that this system will strike fear into the hearts of those who oppose me. The final part of your penance is to flip the lever, releasing the death stones. Do it, now. I looked at him, mutely shaking my head. There was no way on earth I could bring myself to do that. Not to the first woman I had ever loved. Not to the first woman who had shown me any kindness since Momadov had died. I hadn't bothered to take down the gag I wore, not sure if it was permitted, but I had nothing to say in any case. The shaking of my head was all the protest I could muster in my dazed state. The Shah moved closer. Flip the lever, or I'll have you put down there with her. This day will end with her death. Will you have it end with yours, too? He backed up, watching me to see what I would do. I still cannot bring myself to comply. He sighed impatiently. This is your last warning. If I have to put you down there too, I won't send the stones down quickly. It will be the slow descent that crushes the life out of you both. I thought about the horrible pressure I knew my system could exert to snuff the spark out of the human body. I knew it would break me, and I would end my life wailing and possibly even trying to use Miriam as a shield. It was a choice between an ignoble death in which I revealed the depth of my cowardice and a life soaked in the guilt of killing the women I loved. I could almost hear my heart breaking as I placed my hand on the lever. In that moment, I truly knew what it is like to be in someone else's power for the second time in my life. My cry of agony as I moved the lever echoed throughout the hall. I was told later by one of the Shah's guards that Miriam heard me cry out, recognized my voice, and had time to scream my name before the stones ended her life. I never knew whether the man was being truthful or maliciously inventing falsehoods to make me feel worse. I never heard her scream, but that was because I passed out as soon as I moved the lever.